Okay, our third speaker for the session, we're really honored to have Duncan Watts here. Duncan is the Stevens University professor at Penn, where he's a Penn Integrates Knowledge professor, which means that he basically has holds simultaneous positions in multiple departments, and he's in the Wharton School in Operations and Information and Decisions. He's in the Annenberg School of Communication, and he's also in Computer and Information Science. And so, and also he's a director of the Center for Computational Social Science. And I think if you've seen in your brochures, there's a little folders of the brochure about that. So I'm going to tell you a little bit more about what's going on over there. So Duncan's going to be talking about another topic, which is kind of all consistent with all three of these, which are kind of tied together on fake news and echo chambers.
Thanks, Bob. I'm just going to put my phone up here because my wife is 37 weeks pregnant, so if she calls me, I will be bleeding. But hopefully that won't happen. So I want to talk today about some sort of complementary work, I think, to the other to what Renee and Shiri have been telling us about, and I'll try to make a few connections as I go along. Of course, unless you've been living in a cave for the last several years, you will know that we are experiencing an epidemic of fake news in the world. And I'm going to adopt a definition of fake news that's very similar to Renee's definition of disinformation, which is deliberately false content masquerading as legitimate news that is intended to mislead or inflame. So this is not just news that you disagree with or news that you think might be biased or partisan, but news that has been deliberately made up to look legitimate but is not, often with some malintent. And so you can see that there's enormous concern about this topic. From politicians, this is Paul Romer, the economist, writing in the New York Times, describing Facebook and Google as undermining trust in democratic institutions. So there's sort of enormous concern, and Renee has given us lots of reasons to share that concern about the effects on democracy and society of this prevalence of disinformation online. A sort of related, but not exactly the same issue, it has to do with the consequences of algorithms. As Renee mentioned, there's far too much information out there for us to sort of sort it all out ourselves, and so we rely necessarily on some kind of algorithmic curation, and so there have been concerns raised in recent years that there is sort of a bias in these algorithms towards content that is radicalizing, and so YouTube in particular has come under scrutiny for radicalizing its users. So these are very serious concerns. There's clearly something going on, right? That we can see examples. We can go and rely on our own experience of using these platforms. And it's indisputable that there is this disinformation out there, and in particular on social media. And if we go and look for it, we will find stuff that looks really terrible, right? And we will worry about the consequences of that. But there's also a sense in which doing it that way is suffering from the streetlight problem that we're familiar with in academia, where we're studying the problem that we're studying because that's the one that is most salient and obvious to us. And one thing about social media that makes it different from other types of media is the availability of data, right? And so it's very easy to go and collect, millions of tweets from Twitter or posts from Facebook or scrape videos on YouTube, and you go and look for crazy stuff and you find it. It's easy to then draw the connection between that data and these broader social trends that we're worrying about diminishing trust in institutions and increasing affective polarization and so on. And so, what I want to be very explicit about, and Renee actually also said, talked about this as well, is that all of these, the fake news and social media, both exist inside larger contexts. And so one thing that often goes missing in discussions about misinformation or disinformation online is that fake news is a subset of real news, right? So you may not like Fox News, you may worry about its consequences, and in fact you do worry about its consequences, but it is a legitimate news organization, right? And there's a whole ecosystem of other news organizations that also generate an enormous amount of information that potentially is consumed far more by consumers than the fake news. And of course, news itself is only a subset of everything that we're consuming, right? So there's all sorts of ways in which we learn about the world and form opinions, and not all of it is what we would call news, right? In parallel over here, yes, we should worry about social media. These are big platforms. There's a lot of content on them. But it's far from everything, right? There's also a lot of other content online that has nothing to do with social media. And let's not forget about television, that there is a whole sort of universe of content that is not online at all. I would also mention radio. We don't really have data about radio, so I won't talk about it today, but that's certainly something that we worry about a lot. And so the question that I want to ask today, mostly, almost entirely, just very sort of simple, descriptive questions, right? Where do people get their news? How much of it is fake? How much of it is segregated? Do they live in echo chambers or not? And how much news do they even consume at all? Okay, so the data that we're going to use comes mostly from the Nielsen company, the ratings company, who run these very large nationally representative panels for both television and desktop content. We also have more recently mobile content from Nielsen, but that data has become, that panel is very recent, so I won't be using it in the papers that I'll describe today. But in the first paper, we also have we rely on some data from ComScore, which aggregates mobile and desktop. Okay. So what do we find? I'm going to mention very briefly a few papers. I won't be able to get into the details because of time, but all the papers are published, so you're welcome to look at them afterwards if you're interested in the details or to ask questions. So this is a paper that came out a couple of years ago, and most of the results are visible in this single graph here. Okay, so this is 3 years worth of panel data from the beginning of 2016 to the end of 2019, and what we're showing here is the total media consumption for a typical American on a single day. Okay, and you can see that that's a lot, right? It's sort of 417 minutes a day, roughly, of people consuming various types of media on different devices, right? So there's an awful amount of consumption there. But you can also see by looking at the colors, the blue shaded regions refer to content that is not news-related. The green bands refer to content that is news-related, and the red ones refer to fake news. So the first result that you can see very obviously is not coming up. Did I just break this thing? Is there a keyboard? Okay. Oh, looks like it's frozen. That's good. Oh, okay, I must have somehow paused the presentation. So the first result is, maybe surprising to you, maybe not surprising to you, depending on your background. But people basically don't consume much news at all, right? So only about 14% of overall consumption has any relationship to actual news of any type that we can define. And of the content that is news, so if we look now at the green bars, you can see that most of it is on television, right? So about over the whole population, the ratio of consumption of news, TV to online is about 5 to 1. For the youngest category, it's more like 2 to 1. For the oldest category, it's about 8 to 1. But the average is always that for every age category, people consume more news on television than they do online. And strikingly, the vast majority of Americans consume almost no news online at all, right? So about 40-something% consume 0 minutes of news online per day, and 75% consume less than 1 minute a day consuming news online of any sort. And so that seems very strange to probably this crowd. I'm guessing that if you're like me, you spent a lot of time consuming news online and no time watching television, right? And that is makes us horrible representatives of the rest of the country, and so we should not be extrapolating from our own experiences of how things look like to what other people are doing. And the fake news is in the picture there. It's the red bar along the top. You can sort of see it if you squint, but it's a very, very small fraction of overall news consumption, right? Less than 1% of total news and less than 1/10 of 1% of overall media consumption. Right? That's not to say it's not there. Clearly, there are small subpopulations where the consumption is much higher than that. Absolutely appropriate to worry about it, and particularly for those groups. But just as an average overall effect, it's very, very small. And again, this is robust to age categories. Okay. So, maybe the quantity of fake news is small, but you might also worry about the distribution, right? So maybe people are consuming lots of whatever content they're consuming it exclusively from partisan, homogeneous partisan sources. On television, that would be Fox, and on the right, and MSNBC, and maybe you count CNN on the left. Online, there's a whole sort of basket of websites that you can identify as being partisan one way or the other. And so this plot shows all of that. So we have a couple of different definitions of what it means to be segregated. Either half of your diet is from exclusively one side, or 75% of your diet is from exclusively from one side. And the solid colored regions refer to television, and the hatched colored regions refer to online. And you can see, Eli Pariza's book, The Filter Bubble, was published just over 10 years ago, 2011, I think. And so we've been, ever since then, there's been a lot of concern about algorithms kind of steering people into so-called filter bubbles online. You can see from here that could be true, but it affects a very small percentage of Americans. So only about 3% of Americans get their online content. Remember, there's not a lot of online news consumption to begin with, and only a small fraction of that is what you would consider to be a filter bubble or an echo chamber. We use echo chamber in this paper because there's no filter bubbles, there's no algorithmic curation on television. The effect in TV is, again, much, much larger, right? That there are maybe 17% of Americans, about half of that is Fox, and the other half is evenly split between CNN and MSNBC. And the echo chambers in TV are also more persistent over time. So if you I don't have this figure here, but it's in the paper. If you condition on being in an echo chamber in month 0, what's the probability that you're going to be in the same echo chamber in months 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on? And after about 6 months, you're several times more likely to still be in the television echo chamber than you are in an online echo chamber. So TV echo chambers are much bigger and also more persistent over time. Now you might say 17% doesn't look bad, right? Maybe it's, maybe you thought it was going to be more like 80 or 90%, and so, depending on what you're comparing it to, 17% may be small or large, but it's a lot larger than 3%, right? That's the main point. Finally, we have some evidence from this paper as well that there is a over time trend away from relatively middle of the road TV news sources like the networks to the more partisan, extreme cable channels like Fox and MSNBC. So there's sort of kind of migration from centrist to partisan content over time. Finally, let's talk about YouTube. YouTube actually sort of flies a little bit under the radar as a source of news, but it is actually a major source of news compared to other social media sites. News is a small portion of what people consume on YouTube. Mostly they consume entertainment and how-to videos, but about 11% of consumption is news-related. And that just the scale of the platform is so large that results in more than 20 million Americans per month getting some news from YouTube, which makes it sort of about the same size as Twitter in terms of of overall news consumption. And so one question that's come up is that if you sort of sit there and watch YouTube and you just click on the recommendations or you let the autoplay go, that you'll start from some sort of benign topic and you will get steered into increasingly more radical content, and that's exactly the allegation that Zeynep Tufekci made in her New York Times op-ed a few years ago. So this is a study, an observational study, where we look at over time consumption. So we have the same Nielsen panel, and we can see every YouTube link that they've ever clicked on in their lifetime of the panel. And so we can't see what recommendations they're getting. So we can't directly test what the algorithm is recommending. That's something that we're working on now. But we can see what trends they have over time. So if it's true that the algorithm is pushing them into more extreme places, you would expect to see that in their over time consumption. You would expect to see them migrating from centrist to extreme content. And we generally do not see it, right? In fact, people mostly just keep consuming the same stuff that they've been consuming, right? So if you start watching, Saturday Night Live videos, there's a billion Saturday Night Live videos, and I'll just keep showing you more and more and more of them. If you start watching Fox News, you'll probably get lots of Fox News videos, and you'll keep watching Fox News. We don't see trends towards the extremes, and in fact, a little bit the other way, right? And finally, we see very strong consistency between what people consume on YouTube and what they consume in the general web, right? So it is true that some people consume pretty objectionable stuff. There is, some, far right, white supremacist conspiracy theories floating around on YouTube. They're also out there on the broader web. And if you're into that, then you consume it on YouTube, and you also consume it on the web, and there's no real difference between the two. So even if you sort of shut down YouTube tomorrow, you wouldn't necessarily you wouldn't be able to remove all of that content from the broader web, and there are other ways to find it. Now, we could certainly, there's an interesting argument to have about whether YouTube makes it easy for people to get access to that content, and I think that's an interesting question. But in the sort of, in general, you should really think about YouTube, as big as it is, as just being part of this even broader ecosystem that has, the same properties that Renee was talking about earlier. This is really sort of a function of a technology and, sort of a whole ecosystem that we now live in, not any particular platform. Okay, so, what am I pushing for here? I am trying to persuade you. I have an agenda. And that is really that if we, this picture's a few years out of date now, actually. It's way more extreme now. But we just sort of did a little search on Google Scholar to look for papers published on these various topics. And you can see that the focus of the research community in recent years is essentially the opposite of the actual consumption patterns, right? That there's been very little focus on television, a little bit of focus on online, a huge amount of focus on fake news on social media, and that's really the opposite of what people are actually consuming. Again, not to say that this is not a legitimate and important area of concern. We do think that social media is important, and we do think that misinformation and disinformation on social media is important. However, most information is not news, most news is not consumed online, and most consumption is not driven by algorithms, and most of it's not fake, right? So there is, it's not to say we shouldn't study those things, it is to say, in fact, that we should be studying much more than those things, and we're a little unbalanced right now in our focus. So we really need to sort of broaden this perspective, we believe, to look at all of the news, not just the fake stuff. And we need to consider all modes of production and consumption. And so I just want to mention a sort of somewhat unrelated paper that I think has an interesting result that is relevant here, which is an experiment that my colleagues from Microsoft Research and I ran a few years ago, and we were interested in what we call success stories. So a classic success story is about unicorns, startup companies that become worth $1 billion. And a few years ago, there was this sort of idea floating around out there that startup founders who had dropped out of college were somehow better able to make successful companies than people who were sort of boring and stayed in college. And Peter Thiel even sort of bought into this to such an extent that he created a special scholarship fund to pay college kids to drop out of college and go start companies, right? So this is something that, maybe it was a silly idea, but it was at least an idea that some people took seriously. So we ran with this as a kind of context for this more general question that we wanted to ask, which is, can we get people to make bets, real money bets, on their beliefs, right? And can we shift those beliefs around by giving them just different information, right? And so we have these 5 companies that Uber, WhatsApp, Twitter, Facebook, and Spotify that conveniently have 2 co-founders. One of them is a college dropout, and the other one is not a dropout. The other one graduated from college. And so what we did is we sort of told people about this idea, like, people are interested in unicorns. Some people think that if you dropped out of college, if the founder dropped out of college, they're better able to make their company a unicorn. Other people disagree with that. Anyway, here's some examples, right? And we give them the 5 examples of the companies and just show them the dropout founder, right? And the other condition, and the second condition, we tell them exactly the same story, except we flip it around and say some people think that if you graduated from college, you're better able to make your company a success. And other people disagree with that, and we don't really know, but here's some examples, right? And in the control condition, we don't show them any examples. We just say, this is something people are interested in. What do you think? So then we get them to sort of tell us back, say back to us exactly all the things that we told them, so that we know they read all the information carefully. And essentially what they should get from the information, if they're reading it carefully, is that we're not telling them anything at all, right? We're not giving them any useful information, and they should be indifferent between the 2 conditions. But in fact, they have our manipulation had a huge effect on their willingness to bet for one. So then we say, we've drawn 2 companies at random, and one of them is founded by a graduate, and one of them is founded by a dropout. Which one do you think is going to become a unicorn? And you can see that the people in the graduate's condition are about 80% likely to vote for the graduate founder, and the people in the dropout condition are only about 30% likely. So that's about a 50 percentage point difference, which is a huge effect. And again, as Shiru was mentioning, it's very hard to make this effect go away, right? And it's not because interestingly, it's not because they're sort of sitting on the knife edge, right? you might say, well, they don't really know, they've never really thought about this, so they're sort of 50-50, and you're just sort of pushing them a little bit one way or the other, and so it looks like a big effect, but actually it's quite a small effect. That's not what's happening. They're really confident in their bets, right? They express high confidence, and they even make up causal stories. So we are very careful not to give them any mechanism, right? We don't speculate about any of the reasons why these claims might be true, but they come up with them themselves effortlessly, right? So what we learned from this, and why I'm bringing it up in this context, is I don't know why anybody bothers lying, right? Right? Because you can tell people factually correct information, right? We didn't lie here. There was no misinformation here. We were just selectively presenting information to them, and we were able to move their beliefs around sort of by very large amounts. So I think, again, I don't know why you need to lie, okay? Because you might get caught, and then you look bad, and maybe people don't believe you anymore. But if you just say, well, look, everything I told you is true, right, then, it's much harder to attack you, right? And this is something that we see in the mainstream media all the time. And I'll just give a few examples of ways that you can mislead people without lying. One is to just show them the denominator, right? Sorry, just show them the numerator, right? So you say, this is a big number, right? You see this kind of thing all the time. John Allen Paulos wrote about this in the 1990s, in his book, A Mathematician Reads the Newspaper. And it was driving him crazy back then, and it's driving me crazy now, that this is what journalists do all the time. They want to make you think something is a big number, so they just tell you the numerator, and they don't tell you the denominator, right? And so these are actual statistics that were published in, prominent, newspapers, New York Times, Washington Post, etc., in the aftermath of the 2016 election, and you're supposed to get the idea that these are big numbers, but if you look at the relevant denominator, they're all tiny numbers, okay? If they put them as percentages of the, number of ads or number of exposures, you might say, I don't know, why should I care about that? But when you just see the numerator, it looks like a big number, which is, of course, what you're supposed to think. This is one of my favorite examples. Sometimes I wonder why I bother doing quantitative research, because you create a picture like this, and that's all anybody wants to see. This thing still floats around on social media, and every now and again, sort of several years after we put it in an article, this is the 8 days before the 2016 election, and this is the front page of the New York Times in those 8 days, and we've just drawn red boxes around the articles that were about Hillary Clinton's email server. That's 10 articles in 8 days. Interestingly, that's the same number of articles that the New York Times put on their front page about any policy issue at all related to either Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump in the entire 3 months leading up to the election. So there was enormous focus on this one particular issue that I think we can all agree now was not the most important issue of the 2016 election, but that in some ways was what the election was about, a referendum on Hillary Clinton's trustworthiness as a result of this one particular incident. So what was the New York Times trying to do? Good question. But you could, rather than pointing the finger at Facebook, you might wonder maybe the New York Times had something to do with the outcome of the election, right? Because they really, really focused on this issue. Another example that this is one that just came up a week ago on Twitter, is in this case a CNN anchor for bringing someone onto the station and then allowing them to, a politician here, Rick Scott, and allowing them to basically spew conspiracy theories unchallenged, right? So CNN didn't say anything that was misinformation, but they are providing a platform that allows other people to spread. So so just by putting what other people said into their articles and on their shows, mainstream media can mislead by amplification, even though they're not telling you anything wrong. This person actually said that thing, right? They're just quoting someone. This is what journalists do. We go out and ask people what they think and then report what they think. So it's a fact that they said it. You could say it's legitimate content, but it also has the effect of misleading people. Cherry picking is another great trick. This is a nice example from a Washington Post article where the author is claiming that recent data shows that there has been a huge uptick in men wanting to have or having sex. Simon DeDeo at CMU reanalyzed the same data and showed that depending on which period of time you pick, you can tell any story you want, but probably the most reasonable story is the regression line that has no slope at all, right? That nothing has really changed over the period of the data. Finally, headlines are another way to mislead people. This is a nice example where Gordon Pennycook, who's a researcher in this area, is complaining that The Guardian wrote a nice article about their research, and in the text of the article they got the result correct, which is that smart people are really people who score high on a cognitive reflection task, are better able to detect fake news, but the headline writer flipped the result, right? And of course, way more people read the headline than, eighth paragraph of the article. Okay, so what are we doing about this? Clearly we agree that fake news and other forms of outright falsehood are a problem, but there's also this kind of larger problem that there are lots of other ways to mislead people, and there's a whole universe of that just in mainstream media. Social media obviously is important. Algorithms are important, but we have to really pay attention to how all of that fits into all of these other aspects of the broader information ecosystem. If we want to understand these very big questions about what's happening in society right now. And so that's the objective of this project, PennMap, the Penn Media Accountability Project, which is part of my lab, Computational Social Science Lab. And we are assembling some largish data sets around consumption and production of news. And in addition to using that data to write our own papers, we're hoping to make it easier for other people to access this data as well. Thanks very much.
Time for questions?
Okay. How about the back there?
Yeah.